Hello everyone and welcome back to Just Finish Coding. My name is Sriram and this is the third part of the car chase series. In case you haven't watched parts 1 and 2, there will be a card for you right here. By the end of this video, you will have the entire scoring system in place. This will be the case both in the game lobby and the actual game setting. To begin, we have to correct two small errors which were made earlier. The first one is in the manual sprite. Here, we make sure that the size goes to 100% slowly if the mouse pointer is not hovering over it. If we keep the size as 110 in both cases, there will be absolutely no size change and this defeats the purpose of the code in the first place. The second error is in the obstacle sprite. Here, we changed a costume to a random number between 2 and 5. If we just take a look at the costumes tab, we can see that there are only 4 costumes. We just changed the random upper range to 4. Alright, now we can set up the score sprite. If you take a peek at the costumes, you will see that each costume is numbered. The costumes will help us represent the score in a much better way than just showing a variable, but more on this later. When the green flag is clicked, we will first show the sprite. At this point, we have no way of knowing what the score is, so we create a variable for all sprites called score. We will be representing the score graphically and we need clones to do that. We create a block called create clones and check the run without screen refresh checkbox so that it happens within a single frame. Since each clone will represent a particular digit of the score, we have to add a way to differentiate them. The easiest and most effective way is to assign clone numbers for each of them. For this, we create a variable called clone ID for this sprite only. We initially set clone ID to 1 and within a repeat 7, create a clone and change clone ID by 1. At the end of this process, we set clone ID to 0. Let's go over what's happening here. Since clone ID is a private variable, each clone will have its own copy of the variable. When a clone is created, its copy of private variables assumes the value that the sprite had at that exact point in time. When the first clone is created, the clone ID variable of the sprite is 1. Therefore, its own clone ID variable will be set to 1. When the second clone is created, the clone ID variable of the sprite is 2. Thus, its own clone ID will be 2. You can probably see where this is going. The third clone that is created will have a clone ID value of 3, the fourth clone 4, and so on until the 7th clone assumes a value of clone ID 7. We reset clone ID in the end to 0 so that we can differentiate the clones from the sprite itself. This way, the sprite has a clone ID value of 0 while the clones are numbered. Within the sprite, we will first add the score increment during the game and then use some clones to represent them graphically. So let's get first into making the score variable work right. Within the forever loop, we first check if the clone ID is 0. If it is, then we hide. This will only be true of the sprite. This way, the sprite will be hidden while the clones can show themselves. We get into an if-then-else statement next, where we check if the game setting is playing. This is the place where we increment the score. We have to think a little bit more here though. Since we have created 7 clones, we can represent 7 digits of the score. If the score is 8 digits and each clone represents one of the digits, then there will be 1 digit missing out. We don't want this to happen, so we set a max value for that score. We will not increase the score beyond 9,999,999, which is 9 7 times. If the score is below this number, we increment it by 1. The else statement signifies that the player is in the lobby. In this case, we just reset the score to 0. Okay, with that done, the score variable will work correctly. Now we have to set up the clones in such a way that they graphically represent what the score is. First, when the clones are created, we show them, set brightness effect to 40 and go to the front layer. The reason we increase the brightness is to give the score a contrast. The road will be dark grey and the score will be very visible if it's whiter in color. For the position, we keep y as -165 for all clones. For the x position, we set it to -60 plus clone ID minus 1 multiplied by 20. This may seem a bit confusing, so let me explain. The score clones will all have to be next to each other. The score clone with clone ID 1 will be furthest to the left, while the score clone with clone ID 7 will be furthest to the right. Let's say we decide that the first clone should have an x position of -60, while the other clones should follow it on the right. This way, we seem to get that the clone's x position will be -60 plus clone ID multiplied by the clone width. A clone width of 20 works out pretty well. So taking this into consideration, it seems like we get -60 plus clone ID times 20. But this would be an ordering mistake. If we did code this way, then the clone with clone ID 1 will go to a position of -60 plus 1 multiplied by 20, which equates to -40. This is not what we want. We want the first clone to stay at an x position of -60. For this reason, we subtract 1 from clone ID. So we just repeat the process. The first clone's x position will be -60 plus 0 multiplied by 20, which is just -60. This way, each clone gets into the position that we want. Let's get back into the code. Within a forever loop, we move the clones to the front layer. Within an if-else, we check if 7 minus clone ID is less than the length of the score. If this is the case, then we switch the costume of the sprite to letter clone ID minus 7 minus length of score. If this is not the case, we switch costume to 0. Okay, so what on earth is happening here? To understand this, you first have to realize how the score is represented. Let's say that the score was 25. What we'd want is for the first 5 clones to show a value of 0, the 6th clone to show a value of 2, and the 7th clone to show a value of 5. The length of the score in this case is 2. It seems as if we are only switching the costumes if clone ID is greater than 7, which is the number of clones, minus the length of score. We can rewrite this as if 7 minus clone ID is less than the length of score. Let's confirm this with another example. Let's assume that the score value was 326. The first 4 clones should stay as 0, the 5th clone should assume a value of 3, the 6th clone should assume a value of 2, while the 7th clone should assume a value of 6. Let's check the condition. 7 minus clone ID should be less than 3. This will be true of the 7th clone, the 6th clone, and the 5th clone. The 4th clone no longer satisfies this condition, so it should keep its costume as 0. Great, now you can see why the if condition works, but you're probably wondering how exactly we decide which costume to switch to. Let's take the first example again. The score is 25. The first digit of the score is 2, while the second digit is 5. The 7th clone should switch its costume to the second digit of the score, while the 6th clone should switch its costume to the first digit of the score. Again, it seems like there is a pattern. The digit we are switching to seems to be clone ID minus 7 minus length of score. If we take the 7th clone, it will switch to 7 minus 5, which is 2. Now we're not switching the costume to 2. What we're doing instead is switching the costume to letter 2 of score. Thus, we switch costume to 5. Let's make sure that this works for the 6th clone as well. The digit would be 6 minus 5, which is the first digit. Thus, the 6th clone switches its costume to 2 exactly as intended. Let's get back into the code. If this is not the case, then we just keep the costume to 0. We could hide those clones if we wanted to, but the score wouldn't be centered and that wouldn't look too good on the screen. Alright, that's it we need to do for this video. If you test out your code now, the scoring system should work flawlessly. If you've enjoyed this video, please make sure you leave a like, and also don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.